So my name is Zaid, and this is Andrew, my colleague. We are also both co-founders of Morph, which is an experience engine, which is going through the Tupapa incubator. So Panda UX is a Wellington-based agency, so we do a bit of UI UX. So my background is actually in software development. And I was just, a couple of years ago, so intrigued about, I just realized I forgot this, sorry. I was so intrigued about user experience, and ever since 3-4 years ago, I've embraced it in my processes. And I'll be blogging about this on Optimate Workshop very soon. So today, I want to talk to you about culture, values, and experiences. And I want to address the challenge of designing for an evolving audience that speaks different languages, comes from different backgrounds, and on the other side of the scale is to ensure your designs are appealing, relevant, and non-offensive. So how did we get here? Why is this important to me? So, change makers. About a year ago, I got approached by one of the board members from Changemakers, and to see how we could collaborate on developing their refugee services portal. So Changemakers, I'll just tell you a bit about Changemakers. They're a rights-based NGO representing 14 refugee background communities in Wellington. And basically, Ali, who's one of the board members, approached me and said, okay, can we collaborate on developing this refugee support portal? So the vision for the portal was to ensure that New Zealanders from refugee backgrounds participated fully in New Zealand life through community development, research, and advocacy. And the key objectives for the project were to provide refugees clear pathways and information about available services. Because what would happen is that a refugee family would arrive, and then they would approach a service provider or a health institution, and they would get turned away. Or the other challenge would be not knowing what services are available for them. In addition to making information available to community development practitioners and social workers, so those people who are working on the grounds and volunteers. So when Andrew and I sat down and had a chat about the project, we had some preconceived ideas about how it's going to go, really, and just the refugee status in Wellington, at least. And the first thing that we had thought about, or we had perceived, was that all refugees went through a similar settlement process. And secondly, the majority of refugees in New Zealand were of Syrian background, because of the media hype, I guess. And the third thing, that language was the biggest obstacle to settlement in New Zealand. And the fourth thing was there was a lack of support channels. And finally, that whatever solution we're designing or building was going to be self-driven. So a refugee would sit on this great portal and access the information they needed. So we decided to do some research. And so what you see here is some statistics from MB, so Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And what we discovered, actually, over the past 10 years, is that a high percentage of refugees actually came from South America and Southeast Asia, as opposed to how it's perceived in the media that, all refugees are Syrian. But to be fair, there was an influx in the past couple of years. So being a migrant myself, I, who fled the Gulf War in Iraq 25 years ago, along with my parents and siblings, I have had a fair share of challenges to overcome in migrating to this beautiful country. However, I knew the journey of a refugee was very different to that. So this is quite interesting. So both Andrew and I agreed that times have changed. If you look at this photo, so the top part is actually a photo of refugees fleeing in World War II. And on the other hand, a contrasting image of Syrian refugees fighting over PowerPoints to charge their devices so they can stay in touch with family and loved ones. And to me, the second image actually stuck with me, because when you think refugees, you think, oh, they must be, all they're thinking about is food and shelter and so forth. But technology is actually, has become a critical need just as much as water, food, and shelter. So prior to commencing the project, changemakers provided some prototypes and some requirements documentation. You know how they look. They're usually 20, 30 pages long. And but we felt like we needed to really reach out to the users and the actual refugees to learn a bit more about what the needs were. Who are these refugees? Are they really all Syrians? So some of the questions we had, some of the questions we wanted answered was that, how is the journey of a refugee different to that of a migrant? Where do refugees come from and under what schemes? What support channels do they have access to, and so on? Other questions we had, of course. So we set out to organize a series of workshops, initially with the Changemakers team, and later on with a wider user group, which included, of course, refugees. And the key objective was to learn more about difficulties faced by former refugees and finding out about accessing refugee services in Wellington, and how it can be improved. So this is a photo of one of the workshops that was held in collaboration with Changemakers. It was really insightful and very difficult. And I'll let Andrew share his thoughts later on when we come to the languages section. Partly because we had 4 groups. So the first was former refugees, obviously. We had community leaders who were also involved in supporting these refugees. We had service providers, both from government agencies and NGOs, and finally research students from Victoria University. And what we discovered, so we basically had 3 activities in that particular workshop that you saw. So we had a brainstorming session and kind of one-on-one discussions with the guys, with the participants. And one of the key findings that we discovered was that there was actually a lot of people suffered from emotional stress. And that was due to resettlement, wars, political and religious oppression. And that had a great impact on the people. And that is actually in both prior to a conflict, during and after. So it's not just, okay, the conflict happens, and then it's actually quite life-changing, to say the least. So we looked at some stats just to kind of learn a bit more about, the status of the refugees, what sort of profiles we have. And what we learned is actually over 85% of refugees arriving in New Zealand fall into 2 categories. One is, the first is women at risk, and the second fall under the protection scheme. And hence, it demonstrates that a solution, whatever solution we were designing, had to provide support services for those 2 disadvantaged groups.
Language. It was really apparent while going through this workshop what a challenge language is for some people. In my group, we had a Chinese lady, and I have never struggled so much to communicate with someone before. Her understanding of English was very limited. Even when we were using a Google translation app that translated into Chinese characters, there were still struggles. Most of the time she couldn't even answer, or her friend who was bilingual had to translate. This really showed me, who I'm from Rotorua, what a huge struggle it is to be a refugee. Not only do you have to leave your home and your friends and everything you know and be placed in a country that has own cultural norms and ways that you have to learn, but on top of that, then having to learn a brand new language just so that you can communicate shows just how much refugees have to go through to integrate into New Zealand society. But as New Zealand is now their home, they should be made to feel like New Zealanders. They should feel like they are one of us and that they belong. What this means is that the portal that we are designing must allow the refugees to find themselves within New Zealand so that they can access the support services without the need for other people's help. Another key finding that I thought was eye-opening was the fact that literacy, was also a key obstacle in how refugees access available services and having to rely on other things to carry out what we'd consider trivial. And therefore, with fact-finding, we discovered, no, it's not always about making translations available.
All right, so I went back to the stats again to kind of delve a bit deeper into this literacy issues, because it was raised by one of the participants saying that it's not just making translations available. Some people actually can't read and write, which I didn't really think about, to be honest, before going into this. Like, okay, how are we going to build a solution that really supports these impediments? So I looked at some stats, and I discovered that, so this is based on the UNESCO organization, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which I actually found out this morning that for some reason America wanted to exit from that. I was reading on the news like, interesting. And I discovered that in Myanmar and Afghanistan, the literacy levels, which percentage, which is the people who can read and write basically, were very low. And if you recall 2 slides ago, a high percentage of refugees in New Zealand currently are actually from these 2 countries, which makes us, and hence we have to, whatever solution we're providing needs to factor that in, is that, how are we catering for these people of those needs? The other issue that came out from the workshops is that housing was a problem. If you rent in Wellington, you probably know about this problem. So finding warm housing and just knowing your area was actually another obstacle. Because imagine you're getting settled in a new area, you don't know your neighbors. It was a challenge that I personally overlooked. I didn't even think about it, to be honest. And then you have weather. I don't actually have any comments on this side, just like, and then this happens, it's quite amazing. How do you explain this to a refugee? I don't know. So I also learned about the Recipient Program. So there's actually a government and NGOs have actually done a lot of work to make sure the process is easy. So there's a 6-week induction for new refugees that arrive in New Zealand, and the first focus is on empowering refugees to deal with what they call social and coping skills. So that's understanding how to best cope with different situations. The other phase focuses on briefing refugees of their employment options. Unfortunately, it sometimes is not, it's not comforting, but it lays down the, you have this background, you might be able to work in this, and it's like kind of career advice. And the third phase focuses on health assessment, with focus on mental health assessment because of the trauma. The fourth focuses on settlement planning, so where to next from here, because the program only runs for 6 weeks. And then the next phase is the education, improving the language skills, so basic educational stuff. So the key learnings from these workshops and research that we did with changemakers was that, firstly, and this is some advice that we would give to other people who may be working with people of different backgrounds, is to diversify your user groups. So make sure you include, in our case, the refugees, the people working with the refugees, government agencies, NGOs, so mix it up, because each would have different input. The other thing is keep it simple. Like, we got interrupted so many times when we were giving people instructions in terms, okay, this, and to kind of revise our language, make it simple so that the participant understood. Understanding the culture, so you'll have to kind of be aware of what's appropriate, what's not, and so forth. Like in that very session, we had people from Somalia, China, remind me, who else? Jerusalem. It was a good mix. So try and understand the different cultures. Syria as well, sorry, I forgot that. Key one. And the thing that I would say is to be very patient. It's not your typical workshop or session. It's not like, because a lot of you are professionals, so you know how it goes, sit there. It will take a lot longer, and you really need to be patient. All right, meet Gert. So this is Andrew's favorite researcher. Right. So Gert actually, as I kind of started delving a bit deeper into kind of cross-cultural UX and so forth, I started researching about it, and I discovered that Gert actually has, who used to work with IBM, has done a bit of research about culture and how people are influenced by values. And he described culture as collective programming of the mind that distinguishes one group of people or category from another, and it's the glue that holds societies together. He has also some really, I found, weird ideas about how culture is just an imagination and so forth. But I found his, and he's published, if you're interested in the topic, he's published 2 great books, which I haven't read, I'll be honest, but everyone talks about it. And one is the Culture and Organizational Culture, and the other one I forgot about. Okay, just Google it. All right. So what is cultural sensitivity? So cultural sensitivity is being aware that cultural differences and similarities between people exist without assigning them a value. Positive or negative, better or worse, right or wrong, according to your values and beliefs. So it's recognizing, okay, so-and-so is different, they have these things, I may disagree with them, but recognizing it exists, instead of denying it doesn't, and assuming it doesn't. So I also discovered that there was a framework developed by Milton Bennett, who proclaims that people become more and more culturally sensitive as they progress, from having an ethnocentric orientation to an ethno-relative worldview. So that's going from denial, defense, minimization, to acceptance, adaptation, and integration. And I'll hand over to Andrew now to give some reflections on the GLAM sector.
As you can see, there are many challenges surrounding designing a product that meets the needs of multiple cultures. It's quite a challenge. So how do other organisations meet the needs surrounding cross-cultural user experiences? One sector that is constantly involved in delivering cross-cultural experiences is the GLAM sector. It's an internal acronym, so if you haven't heard of it, it stands for Galleries, Libraries, Archives and Museums. While it might seem like worlds away from refugee services, there are many insights that this sector can offer. Myself and Zaid are participating in the 2017 Mahuki Accelerator program run by Te Papa. Whilst there, we have learned that most GLAM organisations have a mandate, often government-driven, to deliver content that meets the needs of its wide-ranging audiences and cultures. Starting at home, Te Papa was opened in 1998 and founded with a Treaty of Waitangi-based mandate to deliver bicultural content. Te Papa is leading the way GLAM sectors in New Zealand deliver content in both te reo Māori and English. And they're famous for having a horse in a glass box. Te Papa delivers bicultural content in many ways to its audiences, from signage in Māori and English and Māori and Pacifica focus exhibits to fully bilingual digital interactives. In fact, Te Papa has been using digital interactives to deliver bicultural content for many years now. Here is an example of an early bilingual interactive. Now, it's approximately 15 years old and UX provides limited flexibility as you only get to choose your language at the beginning of the interactive. And while it is possible to complete the interactive without English prompts, it might confuse non-fluent Māori speakers. Today, things are far more improved. Here is an example of a recently developed interactive for the Te Pāhi Middle. At the top right corner are easy-to-read buttons that allow instant switching between Māori and English. This allows seamless toggling between the two languages. Now, the Te Pāhi Middle Interactive is a small part of the Māori exhibitions at Te Papa. The recently launched Ko Rongowhakaata, the story of light and shadow exhibits surrounds itself around the Rongowhakaata iwi and their stories. This was a completely collaborative design process with the Rongowhakaata iwi to develop the exhibition and its content. This is essential to being able to deliver content that is culturally sensitive and appropriate. By working in this way, the stories of the Rongowhakaata are told by the iwi people from their cultural perspective. The tech used also goes a step further than Te Pāhi. because not only is the content fully bilingual, but you can even change the language from Māori to English halfway through watching a video. And for the English version of the digital interactives, the Māori words are highlighted, and when selected, an English translation is presented, as well as an audio clip of a Māori term. Our cousins across the ditch have similar mandates and requirements to delivering culturally diverse content. I have just arrived back yesterday morning after 10 days in Australia. While there, I learned how GLAM institutions in Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney are delivering cross-cultural experiences. Now, I've probably been to 12 or 13 or 14 museums, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are the highlights. Melbourne Museum. They have a horse in a glass box too. Now, Melbourne, quite like Te Papa, has a cultural mandate to deliver culturally based content, and they have a huge exhibition space dedicated to delivering culture surrounding Indigenous Aboriginal culture, their stories and history. There is a large portion of the museum dedicated to Aboriginal culture. Text and language are prevalent throughout the exhibition space. This includes signage like this that features the Aboriginal text above and the English below. Te Papa have similar signage to this as well. National Museum of Australia, based in Canberra. Well, they actually have a horse's heart in a glass box. Here there was a mandate to deliver exhibitions with a focus on Australian culture and stories. This can be best seen in the recently launched exhibition, Songlines, Tracking the Seven Sisters, which is at the National Museum of Australia. This was a world first in scale and complexity, as it showcases sections of 5 Indigenous, Aboriginal, Western and Central Desert songlines, utilising paintings, photographs, songs, dance and multimedia to narrate the story of the Seven Sisters as they traverse the continent through the 3 states, 3 deserts and 500,000 kilometres. The exhibition is delivered in part by an interactive audio app. This helps to provide a total sensory experience and total immersion in the culture. You really do feel like you're traversing the desert with these women. Like Rongawhakata at Te Papa, this exhibition was driven by cultural representation. It wouldn't have been possible without the inclusion and collaboration of the Aboriginal women and their cultural insights. The experience itself was one of total cultural immersion. It showcased such a powerful in-depth look into the culture that it was almost spiritual. This was most felt when lying down under a dome, which is what this photo is of, with a 360-degree projection. National Portrait Gallery, also in Canberra. So here they have quite a large focus on education, with a lot of school groups going through. And what they found was that a lot of the school groups that go through, the children don't necessarily have English as a first language. So they developed an interactive portraiture app which allows students to use an iPad to talk almost to the paintings in the gallery. But they made sure that the English was very, very, very simplified so that children who do have English as a second language could easily understand it. The Australian Museum and the National Maritime Museum, both based in Sydney, New South Wales, identified a different language requirement for its audiences. Both institutions realised that many of their visitors were native Chinese Mandarin speakers, and thus a decision was made to develop and deliver content for the sector. To ensure that the content developed was appropriate, native Chinese speakers at the museums worked with app developers to deliver content. It became quite clear that translation is not enough. To fully convey another language, the words need to be interpreted. Otherwise, you might end up with signs that don't make sense. So understanding the language, the culture behind the language. This is really, really key, especially when it comes to designing services for people who don't speak English or another language or another culture. So gaining a deep understanding of a culture you're designing for is key to being able to meet their needs. This is to ensure that you're delivering a culturally sensitive experience and one that takes into account their cultural norms. This can be thought of as an immersion in cultural interpretation, to see how that culture lives, to see their struggles, to walk in their shoes. It can almost be described as looking for a cultural lens. All this research has led to the conclusion that to be able to offer a cross-cultural experience, a deep understanding of that culture and culture groups is necessary. It's about being able to understand them at a human level. This will be key to being able to offer comprehensive services for changemakers. To ensure a successful service, a cultural representative for each of the refugee groups represented would be necessary to ensure that the content and the language is delivered in an easy to understand way and in a culturally sensitive way.
Thank you. I also would like to share a bit about some of the key learnings in terms of the implementation, in terms of the implementing the solution. So one of the things that came out also from the very final workshop was to ensure use of a lot of visual aids, and that overcomes the language barrier. The other thing is to ensure that it's localized, so you've included things that accommodate for different cultures. To use simple language, and to use less of metaphors and slang, because not everyone will get it. I personally struggle with some of the slang and metaphors that I see around on the web, but yeah, it's quite important. And the other thing is to be considered and non-offensive. And of course, eliminating stereotypes. So you're dealing with a lot of cultures here. So to invite individuals to participate, to learn about their cultures and values, to keep an open dialogue with different parties, as we touched on early on, to be able to listen and to be patient and give everyone a chance to speak, and to appreciate people's differences. And lastly, to be open-minded and understanding. As for strategy, so the best approach would be to develop a long-term roadmap that outlines your vision, to set up focus groups, to meet the people and the end user, well, I'm not going to say users anymore, following yesterday's session, meet the people and the VIPs, and to identify effective communication channels, to make your content more accessible, and finally, to be proactive and future-proof your solution. So, for example, if you plan to make it bilingual, mention that to the development team, and so forth. So I've just got enough time to play this video, and I think it's amazing because there are a lot of takeaways from this. So it's just 2 minutes. And so this is on a program by the BBC called Amazing Humans, and it looks at those clowns who work with refugees and, just bring them joy. So I'll get that started. Hopefully it will work.
We're clowns, musicians and dancers, performers, play workers, play specialists, and we focus on working with refugee families who are living in harsh environments. When we first got to Idomeni camp, for example, I did have major doubts, like, is this the right place for us? Like, are we insulting them? You see the kids and their first reaction is a bit like, and they look at you and you go, 3, 2, 1, yalla! So we've been doing music, circus, art, dance, cinema, puppet making, ceilidh dances, pizza decorating, anything we can think of to give them an opportunity to feel good and to feel daft and to feel playful.
What is your name? No. Okay. Who can tell me any magic words?
Their eyes sparkle just for a second and they're just kids again, and it's so simple, actually, to be honest.
Before, the kids doesn't have anything to do. Just they stay in the tent. When you come, you make something from nothing.
Beyond politics and beyond all this adult stuff, kids just are kids, and they like to play duck, duck, goose, and they like to run about, and they like to be congratulated for very average artwork, you know, they need that. Our futures are the dreams we have as kids turned into reality. I want them to feel like they could do anything.
Thank you.